The carriage came to a sudden stop outside the church, and Clara Whitmore's heart dropped before she even saw the flowers on the door. She had waited 3 years for this exact building, this exact day, believing with all her heart that she would walk through those doors as a bride. Instead, she stood frozen on the cold stone path, watching ribbons of white silk flutter from the entrance, and she did not yet know that the bride waiting inside was her own sister. Clara had met Edward Langley when she was barely 19. He had come to her family's small estate in the countryside to discuss business with her father, a modest landowner who grew wheat and kept a few horses. Edward was polite, well-spoken, and had a way of making Clara feel like the only person in the room. Within weeks, he was visiting more often than business required. Within months, he was walking with her through the orchard behind her house, speaking softly about a future they might share together. He never made a formal promise, not in the way her father would have liked, but he made many quiet ones. He told her to wait for him. He said he needed time to settle his affairs, to build a proper home, to earn enough to give her the life she deserved. Clara believed him completely. She was young, and she loved him, and love at that age often feels like certainty. Her younger sister, Alice, was different from Clara in almost every way. Where Clara was thoughtful and quiet, Alice was lively and quick to laugh. She had always lived a little in Clara's shadow, though neither sister ever spoke of it directly. Their mother often said that Clara had the patience of a saint, and Alice had the charm of a summer's day. It was meant as a compliment to both, but as the years passed, it became clear that patience and charm do not always lead to the same reward. For 3 years, Clara turned away every other suitor who came to call. There was a kind young doctor from the next town who asked for her hand twice. There was a widowed merchant who offered her security and comfort. Clara refused them both, gently but firmly, because her heart already belonged to a man who had asked her to wait. Her mother worried. Her father grew quiet whenever Edward's name was mentioned. But Clara held on to her hope like a lantern in the dark, certain that the light at the end of the road was real. She wrote to Edward often during the times he traveled for his work in the city. At first, his letters came back warm and full of promises. He wrote of a house he was saving to buy, of a garden he wanted to plant for her, of a wedding day he pictured in his mind. Clara kept every letter in a wooden box beneath her bed, reading them again on nights when doubt crept in. But slowly, the letters became shorter. Then they became rare. Then, for nearly 6 months, they stopped coming altogether. Clara told herself he was simply busy. She told her sister the same thing when Alice asked, with a strange look on her face, whether Edward still wrote to her at all. It was in the spring of the 3rd year that Edward finally returned to the countryside. Clara had imagined this reunion 1,000 times, picturing him kneeling before her with a ring in his hand, finally ready to make good on everything he had promised. But the man who returned was not quite the same man who had left. He was quieter, more careful with his words, and there was a distance in his eyes that Clara could not explain. Still, she welcomed him with open arms, choosing to believe that time and travel had simply changed him, the way they change most people. She invited him to dinner. She invited him to walk with her again through the orchard, and when he accepted, she felt her old hope stir back to life, brighter than it had been in months. What Clara did not notice, in her joy at his return, was how often Edward's gaze drifted toward Alice across the dinner table. She did not notice how easily the two of them fell into conversation, laughing at small things, finishing each other's sentences in a way that Clara and Edward had never quite managed. She was too relieved to have him home, to see what was forming right in front of her. Weeks passed. Edward began visiting the house more frequently, always with some reason tied to business with her father, though the business itself seemed to matter less and less. He would arrive in the afternoon and stay through supper, and more often than not, it was Alice who greeted him at the door, Alice who poured his tea, Alice who walked him partway down the lane when he left for the evening. Clara told herself this was nothing unusual. Alice was friendly with everyone. It was simply her nature. And besides, Edward had waited this long to be with Clara. Surely he would not throw away 3 years of devotion for anything less than the marriage he had promised. One evening, her father called her into his study, his face troubled in a way she had rarely seen. He asked her plainly if she was certain of Edward's intentions. Clara answered with the same certainty she always carried, though for the first time, saying the words aloud felt less like comfort and more like something she was trying to convince herself of. That night, unable to sleep, Clara took out the wooden box beneath her bed, and read through Edward's old letters once more. She read the words he had written about a future together, about a garden, about a wedding day. She held on to those words, like a rope over a widening gap, not yet willing to admit how far the two ends had drifted apart. The next afternoon, Alice knocked softly on Clara's door, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. She said she needed to speak with her, that there was something she could no longer keep to herself. Clara's stomach tightened, even before Alice said a single word, because she recognized that look. It was the look of someone about to hand over news that could not be taken back. Alice began speaking slowly, her voice trembling, saying that she had never meant for any of this to happen, that she had tried to stop her own feelings before they grew too large to control. Clara stood very still, waiting, her heart pounding louder with every passing second, already sensing the shape of what was coming even before her sister said his name. For a long moment, neither sister spoke. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust in the air, and somewhere outside a horse whinnied in the stable, utterly unaware that inside the house, everything Clara had built her hope upon for 3 long years was about to come crashing down in a single, quiet confession that would change the direction of both their lives forever. Alice finally spoke his name, and the moment she did, the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing closer, the air thinner than it had been a breath before. She said that Edward had come to her one evening, weeks earlier, and told her that his feelings toward Clara had changed, that the years apart had shown him something he had not expected to find, and that what he felt for Alice was different, stronger, impossible to ignore. Alice said she had refused him at first, had told him it was wrong, had begged him to remember the woman who had waited faithfully for 3 years. But Edward had returned again and again, patient and persistent, until Alice's resolve had worn thin, like a thread pulled too many times. Clara did not cry in that moment. She simply sat down on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the floor, as though the answer to everything might be hidden somewhere in the wood grain. Alice reached out to touch her shoulder, but Clara flinched away, not out of anger, but because she could not bear to be comforted by the very person who had taken the ground out from beneath her. For days afterward, Clara moved through the house like a ghost. She ate little, she spoke less. Her mother tried to draw her out with gentle questions, and her father avoided the subject entirely, perhaps out of guilt for having sensed the trouble long before it arrived. Alice kept her distance, understanding that whatever bond the two sisters once shared now needed time to breathe, if it could survive at all. Word spread through the small countryside community, the way word always does in places where everyone knows everyone else's business. Neighbors who once admired Clara's patience now whispered about her misfortune. Some pitied her. Others, with less kindness in their hearts, suggested that perhaps Edward had simply found the better sister all along, and that Clara had spent 3 years waiting for a man who was never truly hers to keep. Clara heard these whispers even when they were not meant for her ears. She heard them at the market, at church, in the quiet corners of gatherings where women gathered to trade gossip like currency. Each word landed like a small stone, and though no single stone could break her, the weight of them together pressed down, until she felt she could barely stand beneath it. It was during this difficult time that Clara began to notice something changing within herself. The grief did not disappear, but alongside it grew a quiet anger, not loud or bitter, but steady and clear, like a flame that refuses to be extinguished by wind. She began to ask herself a question she had never dared to ask before. Why had she spent 3 years of her life waiting for a man who could not even promise her a wedding date? Why had she turned away good, honest men who had offered her security and affection, all for the sake of a love that had, in the end, drifted so easily toward her own sister? She did not have an answer yet, but the question itself felt like the beginning of something new. A small crack of light in a room that had otherwise gone dark. Edward, for his part, made no attempt to speak with Clara directly. He sent no letter of apology, no explanation beyond what Alice had already delivered. Clara told herself this cowardice was, in its own strange way, a mercy, because it meant she did not have to sit across from him and pretend to understand something that made no sense to understand. Yet a part of her, the part that had loved him for 3 years, could not help but wonder what she had done wrong, what quality she lacked that her sister possessed, what invisible line she had failed to cross that might have kept him faithful. Her mother, sensing her daughter's silent suffering, sat with her one evening and spoke plainly, in the way only a mother can. She told Clara that loyalty given to someone who does not return it is not a flaw in the person who gives it, but a flaw in the person who fails to deserve it. She said that Clara's patience had never been wasted, even if it had not led where she hoped, because a person who can love faithfully for 3 years is capable of building a whole life of devotion with the right partner, whenever that partner finally arrived. Clara did not believe these words fully in that moment, but she held on to them the way she once held on to Edward's letters, hoping that someday they might prove true. As the weeks turned into a month, the household settled into an uneasy quiet. Alice and Edward's courtship, once secret, became openly known, and with it came the inevitable talk of a wedding. Clara's father, though troubled by the situation, could not forbid a match that had already taken root so deeply, and so preparations began, quietly at first, for a wedding that would join Edward Langley to the younger of the 2 Whitmore sisters. Clara was expected to attend, to smile, to offer her blessing in front of family and neighbors, because to do otherwise would bring shame upon the household and confirm every unkind rumor already circling through the countryside. She agreed to attend, though every part of her wished to be anywhere else in the world on that day. In the meantime, her aunt, a widow who lived in a larger town some distance away, wrote to invite Clara for an extended visit, sensing perhaps that her niece needed to be away from the house where so much had gone wrong. Clara's mother encouraged her to go, believing that new surroundings might offer some relief from the constant reminders of her heartbreak. Clara agreed, packing a single trunk with what few belongings she wished to bring, including, though she was not entirely sure why, the wooden box that still held Edward's old letters. The journey to her aunt's town took the better part of 2 days by carriage, along roads lined with hedgerows and fields turning gold in the late summer sun. Clara spent much of the ride staring out the window, her mind replaying the last several weeks over and over, searching for some clue she might have missed, some warning sign she had overlooked in her own blind devotion. By the time the carriage rolled into the town, dusk had settled over the rooftops, and lanterns were beginning to glow along the main street. Clara's aunt welcomed her warmly, embracing her at the door and promising that this visit would do her a world of good. The house was smaller than Clara's family estate, but comfortable, filled with the scent of baked bread and fresh flowers, arranged in vases along the windowsills. Over the following days, Clara's aunt kept her occupied with small tasks and social visits, introducing her to friends and neighbors, encouraging her to step outside the walls of her own grief, even if only for an afternoon at a time. Clara found herself slowly, cautiously, beginning to breathe a little easier, though the ache of betrayal remained close beneath the surface, ready to rise again at the mention of a wedding, a sister, or a man named Edward. It was during one such visit, at a modest gathering hosted by a family friend, that Clara first heard mention of a name that would, though she did not yet know it, change the entire course of her future. The name belonged to a duke, recently arrived in the region to oversee matters on a nearby estate he had inherited, a man said to be thoughtful, reserved, and entirely unimpressed by the usual games of society. Clara paid the mention little attention at the time, assuming it had nothing to do with her own quiet, wounded life. But fate, as it so often does, was already quietly setting its pieces into motion, preparing a meeting that Clara could not yet imagine, one that would begin not with grand declarations, but with a single, simple exchange of words across a crowded room, on an ordinary evening that would turn out to be anything but ordinary at all. The letter arrived on a bright morning, carried in by her aunt's housemaid, along with the usual post from home. Clara recognized her mother's handwriting at once, and her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal, already guessing at what news it might contain. The wedding date had been set. Edward and Alice were to be married in 6 weeks, at the same small church where Clara had once imagined standing as the bride herself. Her mother's letter was gentle, careful with its words, but the message beneath the kindness was clear. The family expected Clara to return home for the ceremony. To stay away would raise more questions than her presence ever could, and it would give the gossiping tongues of the countryside even more to feed upon. Her mother wrote that she understood how painful this request must be, but she believed that Clara possessed a strength greater than the situation itself, a strength that could carry her through one difficult afternoon, if it meant protecting the family's good name. Clara read the letter 3 times before setting it down. She walked out into her aunt's small garden and sat upon a wooden bench beneath an old apple tree, staring at nothing in particular, allowing the weight of the news to settle over her slowly, the way frost settles over a field at the first true chill of autumn. Her aunt found her there some time later and sat beside her without speaking at first, simply offering the quiet comfort of company. When Clara finally explained the contents of the letter, her aunt listened without interruption, and when Clara finished, her aunt spoke plainly, saying that facing this day with her head held high would do more to silence the gossip than any amount of hiding ever could. She said that people remember courage far longer than they remember sorrow, and that if Clara walked into that church with grace, she would leave with her dignity intact, no matter what anyone else believed about her circumstances. Clara did not feel brave in that moment, but she recognized the truth in her aunt's words, and slowly, over the following days, she began to prepare herself, not for a wedding she wished to attend, but for a performance of composure she intended to give with everything she had left. The 6 weeks passed both quickly and painfully slowly, each day bringing her closer to a moment she dreaded and yet somehow also wished to have finished and behind her. She helped her aunt with small errands around the town, accepted invitations to modest gatherings, and slowly began rebuilding a version of herself that could smile, without the smile feeling entirely false. It was at one of these gatherings, held in the home of her aunt's dear friend, that Clara first laid eyes upon the man whose name she had heard mentioned weeks earlier, without much interest. He stood near the edge of the room, tall and composed, dressed simply, despite his evident status, speaking with quiet attentiveness to an elderly gentleman beside him, rather than working the room the way many men of rank often did. Clara noticed him not because he demanded attention, but because he seemed entirely comfortable without it, a rare quality among the men she had known. Her aunt, following her gaze, leaned close and murmured that the man was Nathaniel Ashford, the Duke of Renfield, recently returned to oversee the estate left to him by a distant relative. She added, with a small knowing smile, that he was considered something of a puzzle among the local families, polite to all, attached to none, and entirely unmoved by the many attempts made to secure his favor. Clara thought little more of him that evening, her mind still too occupied with the looming wedding to spare much attention for a stranger, however composed he appeared. Yet as the evening wore on, a small moment passed between them that she would later remember more clearly than she expected. A tray of refreshments had been knocked slightly askew by a passing servant, and before anyone else seemed to notice, the Duke reached out to steady it, preventing what would have been an embarrassing spill onto a nearby guest's gown. He did this quietly, without drawing attention to his own kindness, and returned to his conversation, as though nothing had happened at all. Clara found herself watching him a moment longer than she intended, struck by the quiet decency of the act, so different from the loud gestures of charm she had grown used to, in men who wished to be noticed. She said nothing of it to anyone, tucking the small observation away much like she had once tucked away Edward's letters, though this time without quite understanding why she felt the need to keep it. The following weeks carried Clara steadily toward the day of the wedding, and as the date approached, her aunt insisted on accompanying her back to the family estate, unwilling to let her face the ordeal entirely alone. They traveled together, the same road Clara had taken weeks earlier now reversed, the golden fields of late summer beginning to fade into the first browns of early autumn. Arriving home felt strange to Clara, as though she were stepping back into a life that had moved on without her, the household already deep in preparations for a celebration that was not her own. Ribbons and flowers had begun to appear throughout the house. Her mother moved briskly from room to room, overseeing details with the practiced efficiency of a woman determined to see her younger daughter married well, even as she cast worried glances toward her elder daughter whenever she thought Clara was not looking. Alice, for her part, seemed caught between joy and guilt. Her happiness at her upcoming marriage dimmed each time she crossed paths with her sister in the hallway. She attempted, on more than one occasion, to speak with Clara privately, to offer some form of comfort or explanation, but Clara found she could not yet bear such conversations, and she gently but firmly kept her distance, preferring silence to words that could not undo what had already been done. As for Edward, he avoided the house almost entirely during those final days before the wedding, arriving only briefly to finalize arrangements before departing again, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of simple cowardice. Clara caught sight of him only once, across the garden, and their eyes met for the briefest of moments before he looked away, unable, it seemed, to hold her gaze for longer than a heartbeat. The night before the wedding, Clara lay awake in her old bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. She thought of the wooden box still packed away in her trunk, of the letters within it that had once meant everything to her, and she made a quiet decision, there in the darkness, that after tomorrow, she would finally let them go, not out of forgiveness, but out of a growing understanding that holding on to them any longer would only keep her tethered to a version of herself she no longer wished to be. Morning arrived cool and clear, the kind of autumn morning that seems almost too gentle for the weight it carries. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a simple gown of pale blue, and stood before her mirror for a long moment, studying her own reflection, as though searching for the strength her aunt had promised she possessed. She did not find it in her face, not entirely, but she found something close to it, a quiet resolve settling over her features as she smoothed the fabric of her dress and turned toward the door. The carriage ride to the church felt impossibly short and impossibly long all at once, and when it finally came to a stop, Clara stepped down onto the path exactly as she had a lifetime ago in her own imagination, though this time the doors ahead did not open for her. Inside the church, the air smelled of candle wax and autumn flowers, and rows of familiar faces turned briefly to watch Clara as she walked to her seat near the front, close enough to family duty, far enough to preserve what dignity remained to her. She kept her chin level, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes fixed on a point just above the altar, refusing to let them drift toward the door through which her sister would soon appear. When the music began and the doors opened, a ripple of soft gasps and murmurs passed through the gathered guests, the kind of sound reserved for brides who look particularly radiant on their wedding day. Clara did not turn her head immediately, but when she finally allowed herself to look, she saw Alice walking down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her face glowing with a happiness that Clara remembered once believing would belong to her. Edward stood waiting at the altar, dressed in his finest, his expression a careful mixture of solemnity and joy, the same expression, Clara realized with a quiet ache, that she had once imagined he would wear for her. She watched the ceremony unfold with a strange sense of distance, as though she were observing the scene from somewhere outside her own body, every vow spoken feeling like a small blade drawn slowly across an old wound. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, and the small crowd rose in applause, Clara rose with them, clapping softly, her face arranged into the calm, gracious expression she had practiced in her mirror that morning. No one watching her closely could have said with certainty whether her smile was genuine, and that uncertainty, she realized, was precisely the armor her aunt had encouraged her to wear. The reception that followed was held in a large tent erected on the grounds of the Whitmore estate, filled with tables of food, music from a small string quartet, and the constant murmur of guests, offering their congratulations to the newly married couple. Clara moved through the gathering with practiced grace, accepting condolences disguised as pleasantries from those who could not resist commenting on her situation, and receiving genuine kindness from others who simply admired her composure under such difficult circumstances. At one point, Alice approached her sister quietly, away from the crowd, her eyes glistening with unshed tears despite the joy of her day. She told Clara that she was truly sorry, that she had never wished to cause her such pain, and that she hoped someday, even if not soon, the two of them might find their way back to the closeness they once shared. Clara listened to her sister's words without interrupting, and when Alice finished, she offered a single nod, not quite forgiveness, but not quite rejection either, a small bridge left standing between them, for some future day when either might be ready to cross it. Edward, for his part, approached Clara only once during the entire celebration, his expression uncertain, his words halting as he attempted to offer some form of gratitude for her presence and her grace in attending. Clara listened politely, her expression unreadable, and when he finished speaking, she offered only a brief response, wishing him and her sister well, before turning to greet another guest, leaving him standing slightly stunned by how easily she had managed to close that particular door. By the time the celebration wound down into evening, Clara felt an exhaustion unlike any she had known before, not merely physical, but the deep weariness that comes from holding oneself together through hours of performance. She excused herself early, retreating to her room while the music and laughter continued outside, and there, alone at last, she allowed herself to cry, quietly, without shame, releasing the tears she had held back throughout the entire long day. When the tears finally subsided, Clara rose from her bed and retrieved the wooden box from her trunk, carrying it out to the small fireplace in the corner of her room. She opened the box slowly, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting one final time, reading a few scattered lines from letters she had once treasured beyond measure. Then, without hesitation, she fed them one by one into the flames, watching the paper curl and blacken and disappear entirely, until nothing remained of Edward Langley's old promises, but a small pile of ash settling quietly in the grate. It was not an act of anger, though anger still lived somewhere within her, nor was it entirely an act of peace, since peace still felt distant and uncertain. It was, instead, an act of release, a deliberate closing of one chapter, so that whatever came next might have room to begin, without the weight of the old one pressing down upon it. The following morning, Clara informed her mother of her decision to return to her aunt's town for an extended stay, longer than the visit had originally intended. Her mother, though saddened at the thought of her daughter's continued absence, understood the necessity of it, and gave her blessing without argument, perhaps recognizing that some wounds heal better away from the very ground where they were made. Within the week, Clara found herself once again upon the familiar road leading away from her family's estate, watching the fields and hedgerows pass by the carriage window, though this time there was a different quality to her thoughts, less consumed by grief, more curious about what shape her life might take, now that the path she had followed for 3 years had closed entirely behind her. Her aunt welcomed her back with open arms and a knowing warmth, asking no questions about the wedding, beyond what Clara volunteered on her own. Life in the small town resumed its gentle rhythm, filled with quiet mornings, modest social calls, and the slow rebuilding of a spirit that had been, for a time, badly bruised. It was during one such quiet afternoon, weeks after her return, that Clara found herself once again, in the company of Nathaniel Ashford, the Duke of Renfield, at a small charitable gathering, organized to raise funds for the town's modest hospital. Neither of them could have known, in that ordinary moment of polite introduction, that a conversation begun over a simple matter of donation ledgers would grow, slowly and steadily, into something neither of them had expected to find again after the disappointments life had already dealt them both. The charitable gathering had been organized in the town hall, its wooden floors polished, and its walls decorated with simple garlands in honor of the occasion, though the true purpose of the event lay in the ledgers spread across a long table near the entrance, where donations were carefully recorded for the benefit of the small hospital that served the townsfolk and surrounding farms. Clara had been asked by her aunt's friend to help oversee the recording of contributions, a task she accepted gladly, grateful for something useful to occupy her hands and her mind. It was there, bent over the ledger with a pen in hand, that she first spoke directly with the Duke. He approached the table quietly, without any of the fanfare that often accompanied men of his standing, and placed a modest sum into the collection box before asking, in a voice both low and clear, whether the funds raised that evening would go toward medical supplies or toward wages for the small hospital's staff. Clara, slightly surprised by the practicality of his question, explained that the funds were divided between both needs, with priority given to whichever shortage was most urgent that particular season. He nodded thoughtfully at her answer, and asked a few more questions, each one showing a genuine interest in the details, rather than the polite curiosity often offered simply to fill silence. Clara found herself answering more freely than she expected, drawn out by the sincerity in his manner, and before either of them quite realized it, several minutes had passed in easy conversation about matters as unremarkable as bandages and medicine, and yet somehow, the exchange felt far from unremarkable at all. When their conversation was finally interrupted by another guest requiring the Duke's attention, he thanked Clara for her patience in answering his questions and excused himself with a small, respectful bow. Clara returned to her ledger, her cheeks slightly warm, though she told herself it was merely the heat of the crowded room, rather than anything more significant. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again, first by simple coincidence at another social gathering, and then, gradually, by arrangements that felt less coincidental with each passing occasion. The Duke, it seemed, had taken a genuine interest in the charitable efforts of the town, and Clara, through her aunt's connections, found herself frequently involved in the same causes. Neither of them spoke openly of any deeper intention behind these repeated meetings, yet both began, quietly, to anticipate them. Nathaniel Ashford was, in many ways, unlike any man Clara had known before. He carried his title with a quiet humility rather than pride, often preferring to listen more than he spoke. And when he did speak, his words carried the weight of careful thought rather than empty charm. Clara learned, in bits and pieces gathered across several conversations, that he had inherited his title somewhat unexpectedly, following the death of a distant relative, and that he had spent several years abroad before returning to take up responsibilities he had never particularly sought for himself. She also learned, though he shared this only once, in a quieter moment away from the crowd, that he too carried the memory of a disappointment from his younger years, a betrothal arranged in his youth that had ended not through his own choice but through circumstances beyond his control, leaving him wary of hasty affections and careful with his trust ever since. This small confession, offered without self-pity, struck a chord within Clara that she had not expected, a recognition of shared understanding between two people who had each learned, in their own painful ways, that promises are not always kept simply because they are made. As autumn deepened into the colder months, their conversations grew longer and more comfortable, moving beyond charitable matters into subjects of books they had read, places they hoped to see, and small observations about the world that revealed more of their characters than either perhaps intended. Clara found herself looking forward to these exchanges with an eagerness she had not felt in a very long time, though she was careful, even in her own private thoughts, not to name that eagerness as anything more than simple friendship. Her aunt, however, was less cautious in her observations, remarking on more than one occasion how the Duke's manner softened noticeably whenever Clara entered a room, and how Clara herself seemed to carry a lighter step on the days she knew their paths might cross. Clara dismissed these observations with a small laugh, insisting that gratitude for his kindness and shared interest in charitable work were the only feelings at play. Yet even as she spoke these denials aloud, some quiet part of her recognized them for the small untruths they were. It was during a modest gathering, held to celebrate the arrival of the first snowfall, that the nature of their acquaintance began to shift more openly. The gathering had spilled out briefly onto the frost-covered lawn, guests admiring the pale blanket of white settling over the town, and Clara had found herself standing slightly apart from the others, watching the snow drift down in the lantern light. Nathaniel joined her there, saying little at first, simply standing beside her in comfortable silence, until he finally spoke, admitting quietly that he found himself looking forward to their conversations more than he had anticipated when he first arrived in the region, and that he hoped she might feel similarly, if she was willing to say so honestly. Clara considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next might shift the careful balance they had built between them. She admitted, in words as measured as his own, that she too had come to value their conversations a great deal, and that his company had brought her a sense of peace she had not expected to find again, so soon after the difficulties of the past year. Neither of them said more than that in the moment, but something had shifted between them nonetheless, a quiet acknowledgement that their friendship carried the potential for something deeper, should they both choose to let it grow. From that evening forward, their meetings took on a new quality, still measured and respectful, but carrying an undercurrent of understanding that had not existed before. Nathaniel began finding reasons to call upon Clara's aunt more frequently, always with proper courtesy, and Clara, in turn, found herself dressing with a little more care on the mornings she expected he might visit, though she told herself each time that it was simply good manners, rather than anything more particular. Word of the Duke's growing attentions toward Clara Whitmore did not take long to spread through the small town, and though some raised eyebrows at the notion of a duke courting a woman whose own family had so recently endured public heartbreak, most who knew Clara personally found themselves quietly pleased at the turn of fortune, believing that few women deserved a second chance at happiness more than she did. News of this budding courtship eventually made its way back to Clara's family estate as well, carried through the usual channels of letters between relatives and travelers passing between the two towns. Her mother wrote with cautious excitement, urging Clara not to rush her heart, but expressing genuine hope that her daughter's patience might finally be rewarded, in a manner far beyond what she had once hoped for with Edward. Even Alice, in a brief note included alongside their mother's letter, expressed her happiness at the news, though she was careful not to presume too much familiarity, given the distance that still lingered between the two sisters. Clara read these letters with a mixture of emotions, grateful for her family's support, yet also aware of how strange it felt to have her private, still uncertain feelings already becoming a subject of discussion so far from where they had begun. She resolved, for the time being, to focus less on where this new connection might lead, and more on simply allowing it to unfold at its own natural pace, trusting, for perhaps the first time since Edward's betrayal, that patience, given honestly to the right person, might finally be met with the same honesty in return. Winter settled fully over the town by the time Nathaniel's aunt, Lady Beatrice Ashford, arrived for an extended visit at his estate. A formidable woman, known throughout the region for her sharp tongue and her firm opinions on matters of family and rank. She had heard, through her own network of correspondence, of her nephew's growing attachment to a young woman of modest means, and she arrived determined to assess the situation for herself before any further steps were taken. Clara was invited, along with her aunt, to a formal dinner at the Ashford estate shortly after Lady Beatrice's arrival, and she spent the better part of an afternoon preparing herself for the encounter, aware that this evening would likely determine a great deal about how smoothly, or how roughly, her connection with Nathaniel might proceed. She dressed simply but elegantly, choosing a gown of deep green that her aunt insisted brought out the warmth of her eyes, and she rehearsed in her mind the kind of composed, gracious manner she had once summoned for her sister's wedding, hoping it might serve her equally well tonight. The estate itself was grander than anything Clara had visited before, its halls lined with portraits of ancestors long since passed, its dining room lit by rows of tall candles that cast a warm glow over polished silver and fine china. Lady Beatrice greeted her with polite but pointed questions throughout the meal, inquiring after her family's standing, her education, her prospects, and her understanding of the responsibilities that came with a title such as her nephew's. Clara answered each question honestly and without excessive flattery, refusing to pretend to a background grander than her own, yet also refusing to shrink from the conversation out of intimidation. At one point, Lady Beatrice remarked, not unkindly but bluntly, that a duke's wife required more than charm and good sense, that she required the steadiness to endure scrutiny from every corner of society for the rest of her life. Clara met her gaze evenly and replied that she had already endured a fair share of scrutiny in recent months, following circumstances entirely outside her own choosing, and that she had learned, through that difficult experience, exactly how much steadiness she possessed. The room fell briefly silent at her answer, and then, to the surprise of nearly everyone present, Lady Beatrice offered a small, approving nod, remarking that an honest answer was worth far more to her than a rehearsed one. Nathaniel, who had watched the exchange with quiet tension throughout, allowed himself a small breath of relief once his aunt's manner softened, and later that evening, as the guests began to take their leave, he walked Clara and her aunt to their waiting carriage, lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary, to tell Clara quietly that she had handled his aunt's questioning with more grace than he had dared to hope for. Yet not everyone connected to the Ashford family proved so easily won over. A distant cousin of Nathaniel's, a young woman named Margaret Ellery, who had long harbored her own hopes of securing the Duke's attention through a more advantageous family connection, made her displeasure known through a series of subtle slights whenever their paths crossed at social gatherings that winter. She spoke of Clara's situation in tones dripping with false sympathy, reminding anyone who would listen of the scandal surrounding her sister's marriage, and suggesting, with careful implication, that a woman once left behind by one man might not be the wisest choice for another of far greater standing. Clara heard these comments secondhand, carried to her through the well-meaning but occasionally indiscreet remarks of mutual acquaintances, and though they stung, she found herself less shaken by them than she once might have been. She had already survived far sharper wounds than the jealous murmurs of a woman whose own ambitions had simply gone unmet, and she resolved not to let such comments dictate the course of a happiness she was only just beginning to allow herself to feel. Nathaniel, upon learning of his cousin's behavior, addressed the matter directly, speaking with Margaret privately and making clear, in terms she could not misunderstand, that his regard for Clara was not a matter open to further commentary or interference. Margaret, though outwardly offended, ceased her subtle campaign shortly afterward, whether out of genuine understanding or simple recognition that her efforts had failed to achieve their intended result. As winter began to loosen its grip, and the first signs of an early spring appeared along the hedgerows and fields, Nathaniel invited Clara to walk with him through the grounds of his estate, a sprawling property that included a garden currently bare from the season, but clearly well tended in warmer months. He spoke, as they walked, of his plans to restore parts of the garden that had fallen into neglect under his predecessor's care, describing with quiet enthusiasm the flowers he hoped to plant along the southern wall once the frost lifted entirely. Clara listened with genuine interest, offering a few suggestions of her own, based on the modest garden she had helped tend at her family's estate, and as their conversation continued, she felt a small, unexpected pang of recognition, remembering another garden, another conversation, another man who had once spoken of flowers, and a shared future that never came to pass. Yet the feeling that rose within her now was different from the anxious hope she had once carried with Edward. This time, she felt something steadier, a quiet confidence rooted not in blind faith, but in the accumulated evidence of a man's consistent character, proven through months of honest conversation and careful action, rather than empty promises made and left unfulfilled. It was during this same walk, as they paused near a frozen fountain at the garden's center, that Nathaniel turned to Clara with an expression more serious than she had seen from him before, and told her plainly that he did not wish to rush matters between them, given all she had already endured, but that he could no longer pretend his feelings were anything less than genuine, deep, and steadily growing with each passing week they spent in one another's company. Clara, her breath catching slightly in the cold air, admitted in return that she felt precisely the same, though she confessed also to a lingering fear, born of her past experience, that trusting too fully and too quickly might once again lead to disappointment. Nathaniel listened to her fear without dismissing it, and instead offered a promise unlike any Edward had ever given her, a promise not of some distant future arrangement, but of patient, consistent presence, day by day, for as long as it took for her trust to grow secure. He told her he understood that words alone could not undo the damage of a broken promise, and that he intended, instead, to prove himself through actions she could witness and rely upon over time. It was, Clara realized as she listened, exactly the kind of promise she had needed all along, one built not on hope alone, but on the quiet, steady evidence of a character she had already come to know and respect. It was in early spring, not long after that quiet conversation by the frozen fountain, that Clara received word her family would be traveling to the nearby town for a regional gathering, a modest fair held annually to celebrate the turning of the season, drawing families from several surrounding estates together for a single festive weekend. Her mother's letter mentioned, almost in passing, that Edward and Alice intended to attend as well, now several months into their marriage, and that the family hoped Clara might join them, given how much distance and time had passed since the wedding. Clara considered the invitation carefully. Enough months had passed that she no longer felt the sharp, immediate pain that had once accompanied any mention of her sister's marriage, yet she could not deny a certain wariness at the thought of standing in the same space as Edward once more, particularly now that her own life had begun moving in a direction so different from anything she had once imagined with him. After discussing the matter with her aunt, and receiving a brief but encouraging note from Nathaniel, who would also be attending the gathering due to his own family's connections in the area, Clara decided to accept the invitation, resolved to face whatever discomfort the reunion might bring, with the same composure she had cultivated over the past months. The fair itself was a lively affair, filled with stalls of local goods, music from traveling performers, and the general cheerful noise of a community eager to shake off the last of winter's chill. Clara arrived with her aunt, and soon found herself reunited with her parents, and, shortly after, with Alice, whose greeting carried a mixture of genuine warmth and lingering uncertainty. The two sisters exchanged careful pleasantries, testing the waters of a relationship still healing, and Clara found, to her own quiet relief, that speaking with Alice no longer felt like walking over broken glass, but rather like carefully rebuilding a bridge that had been damaged, plank by cautious plank. It was Edward's reaction, rather than Alice's, that Clara found more difficult to anticipate. When their paths finally crossed, near a stall selling early spring blossoms, Edward's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, discomfort, and something else Clara could not immediately name, though she would later come to recognize it as regret. He offered a stiff but polite greeting, inquiring after her health and her time spent with her aunt, and Clara responded in kind, her tone even and unbothered, betraying none of the old anxieties that might once have accompanied such an exchange. It was only later that afternoon, when their paths crossed a second time near the edge of the fairgrounds, away from the immediate crowd, that Edward spoke more openly, his voice lowered, as though the words cost him some effort to release. He told Clara that he had heard, through mutual acquaintances, of her growing acquaintance with the Duke of Renfield, and he admitted, with visible discomfort, that the news had struck him harder than he expected, forcing him to reckon with feelings he had assumed were long settled. Clara listened to his words without offering the comfort he perhaps hoped for, her expression calm but firm as she reminded him, gently but plainly, that whatever regrets he now carried were the direct result of choices he alone had made, choices that had cost her 3 years of devoted patience in exchange for a broken promise. She told him she held no anger toward him any longer, not because his actions had been forgivable, but because holding on to that anger would have cost her far more than it ever cost him, and she had chosen, for her own sake, to release it. Edward, visibly humbled by her steady response, admitted that he had perhaps taken for granted the depth of loyalty she had once given him, believing, in his own youthful uncertainty, that a familiar comfort might serve him better than the uncertain intensity of the love Clara had offered so freely. He confessed that watching her now, composed and clearly valued by a man of Nathaniel's character, had shown him precisely what he had carelessly let slip through his own hands. Clara accepted his admission with quiet grace, offering neither forgiveness nor bitterness, but simply the calm acknowledgement of someone who had already moved beyond needing anything further from him. She wished him well, sincerely, in his marriage to her sister, reminding him that Alice deserved his full devotion now, undivided by lingering regrets over a path he had chosen not to walk. With that, she excused herself and returned to the fairgrounds, leaving Edward standing alone among the spring blossoms, confronted at last with the full weight of what his own indecision had cost him. Later that evening, as the fair wound down into a soft twilight gathering, Nathaniel found Clara near the edge of the grounds, watching the last of the sunset color the sky in shades of orange and violet. He asked, gently, whether her day had been difficult, having heard secondhand of her earlier encounter with Edward. Clara considered the question honestly before answering that the encounter had been strange, but not painful, and that she found herself surprised by how little power Edward's words still held over her heart. Nathaniel took her hand then, something he had not done before in such an open setting, and told her quietly that he admired, more than he could easily express, the strength she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, not merely in surviving her heartbreak, but in emerging from it, with her capacity for trust and love still fully intact. Clara, moved by his words, found herself blinking back unexpected tears, though these tears carried none of the sorrow of months past, only a quiet, overwhelming gratitude for how far she had come, and for the steady, patient man now standing beside her, holding her hand beneath a darkening spring sky. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the stars begin to appear one by one, both of them sensing, without needing to say it aloud, that the events of that single day had marked a quiet turning point, closing one chapter of Clara's life fully and completely, while opening another that promised, for the first time in a very long while, to be built upon a foundation far sturdier than hope alone. Summer arrived early that year, bringing with it long, warm evenings and gardens finally bursting into full bloom across the region, including the southern wall of Nathaniel's estate, where the flowers he had once described to Clara during their winter walk now stood in vivid rows of color, exactly as he had promised. It was in this very garden, on an evening warmed by the last golden light of the setting sun, that Nathaniel arranged for a small gathering of close family and friends, ostensibly to celebrate the garden's successful restoration, though he carried within him a far greater purpose for the evening than anyone present yet suspected. Clara arrived dressed in a gown of soft yellow, her aunt beside her, both women unaware of the careful planning that had gone into the evening's arrangements. She admired the garden's transformation with genuine delight, walking slowly along the paths lined with blossoms, remarking to Nathaniel how remarkably the space had changed since the bare, frost-covered afternoon when he had first shared his plans for its restoration. As the small gathering mingled and the evening light softened further into dusk, Nathaniel guided Clara gently away from the other guests, leading her toward the very fountain where they had once stood together amid the winter frost, now surrounded by blooming flowers rather than ice. There, with the last light of day casting a warm glow over the garden, he turned to face her fully, and Clara, sensing the shift in his manner, felt her heart begin to quicken, with an anticipation entirely different from the anxious hope she had once carried, for another man, another proposal, another future that had never arrived. Nathaniel spoke first of the months that had passed since their first conversation over a modest ledger of charitable donations, reminding her of how unexpectedly their acquaintance had grown into something far deeper than either of them had anticipated. He spoke of her strength, her honesty, and her remarkable capacity to remain open-hearted despite the pain she had endured, qualities he told her he had come to treasure more deeply than any title or fortune he possessed. Then, lowering himself before her among the blossoms of the very garden he had built with her in mind, he asked Clara Whitmore, plainly and sincerely, whether she would consent to become his wife, not out of obligation or convenience, but out of a shared devotion he intended to honor faithfully for the whole of their lives together. Clara, her eyes bright with unshed tears of an entirely different nature than those she had once cried alone in her room after her sister's wedding, answered without hesitation, telling him yes, that she would be honored and overjoyed to become his wife. The small gathering nearby, alerted by a sudden hush followed by a burst of applause, turned in time to witness the moment Nathaniel rose and gently placed a ring upon her finger, sealing a promise that Clara now felt certain, with every fiber of her being, would be kept. Word of the engagement spread quickly through both towns, carried by letters and travelers eager to share such welcome news. Clara's family received the announcement with genuine joy, her mother weeping happy tears as she read the letter aloud to her husband, and even Alice, upon hearing the news, wrote a heartfelt letter of congratulations, expressing her sincere hope that her sister had finally found the steady, faithful love she had always deserved. The wedding itself was arranged for early autumn, a season Clara had once associated only with the pain of her sister's marriage, but which she now welcomed eagerly as the season of her own long-awaited happiness. The ceremony took place not in the small countryside church of her youth, but in the grand chapel attached to Nathaniel's estate, its stone walls adorned with autumn blossoms in shades of deep red and gold, gathered from the very garden where he had proposed. Guests arrived from both towns, filling the chapel with familiar and new faces alike. Clara's parents sat proudly in the front row, her father's eyes suspiciously bright throughout the ceremony, her mother clutching a handkerchief she dabbed at intermittently. Alice and Edward attended as well, seated further back among the other guests, and though Clara caught sight of them only briefly as she walked down the aisle, she felt none of the old bitterness that might once have colored such a moment, only a quiet, gracious acknowledgement that every path, however painful, had led her precisely to where she now stood. Nathaniel waited for her at the altar, his expression carrying none of the careful reserve she had once observed in him at their first meeting, replaced instead by an open, unguarded joy that mirrored her own. As she took her place beside him, Clara felt, for the first time in 3 long years, a complete and unwavering certainty that the vows about to be spoken would be honored fully, not out of youthful promise made lightly, but out of a devotion proven steadily across months of honest, patient courtship. The ceremony proceeded smoothly, the vows exchanged with quiet sincerity, and when the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted into warm applause, none louder or more heartfelt than that offered by Clara's own family, who had watched her endure so much only to arrive, at last, at this deserved and joyful conclusion. At the reception that followed, held once again in the very garden where the proposal had taken place, Clara found herself, at one point during the evening, standing near enough to Alice and Edward to exchange a few words. Alice embraced her sister warmly, telling her how truly happy she was to see her radiant and cherished exactly as she deserved. Edward, standing slightly apart, offered his own sincere congratulations, his earlier regret now settled into a quiet, humbled respect for the resilience Clara had shown throughout the entire ordeal. As the evening deepened, and the garden lanterns cast their warm glow over the celebrating guests, Clara stood beside her new husband, surveying the scene with a heart finally at peace. She thought back, briefly, to the frightened, hopeful young woman who had once waited 3 long years for a promise that was never truly hers to keep, and she felt, standing now in this garden, as the Duchess of Renfield, an overwhelming gratitude for every difficult step that had led her to this moment, understanding at last that sometimes the greatest heartbreaks clear the way for the truest happiness a person could ever hope to find. A year passed swiftly after the wedding, filled with the quiet, steady rhythms of a marriage built on genuine trust rather than uncertain hope. Clara settled comfortably into her new life as Duchess of Renfield, dividing her time between managing the household alongside Nathaniel and continuing her work with the charitable causes that had first brought them together over a simple ledger of donations. The estate's garden flourished further each season, tended now with equal care by both husband and wife, who often walked its paths together in the early evenings, discussing plans for the estate, for their charitable efforts, and eventually, for the family they hoped to build together. Lady Beatrice, who had once questioned Clara so pointedly at that first formal dinner, became over time one of her most devoted supporters, often remarking to other relatives that her nephew had chosen far better than any arranged match could have offered him, praising Clara's steady character and genuine warmth to anyone willing to listen. Margaret Ellery, whose jealousy had once cast a shadow over the early months of their courtship, eventually married a gentleman from a neighboring estate and, whether through genuine change of heart or simple resignation, ceased entirely her earlier unkindness, occasionally even exchanging polite correspondence with Clara at larger family gatherings. Clara's relationship with Alice healed slowly but steadily over that first year, the two sisters exchanging regular letters and visiting one another whenever distance and circumstance allowed. Though the shadow of the past never fully disappeared between them, both sisters came to understand that holding on to old wounds served neither of their futures, and they built, patiently, a new closeness, founded on honesty rather than old expectations. Edward, for his part, settled into a quieter, more attentive version of himself within his marriage to Alice, having learned, through the painful consequences of his own past indecision, the true cost of half-hearted promises, and he devoted himself thereafter to being the steady husband Alice deserved. Clara often thought back, in quiet moments, to the 3 years she had spent waiting faithfully for a man who ultimately could not keep his word, and though the memory still carried a faint echo of old pain, she no longer viewed those years as wasted time, but rather as the necessary trial that had taught her to recognize true devotion when it finally arrived. She understood now, with the clarity that only distance and healing can provide, that her years of patience had not been given to the wrong man out of foolishness, but simply out of a hopeful heart that had not yet learned to distinguish between promises spoken and promises truly meant. In the years that followed, Clara and Nathaniel welcomed 2 children into their family, a daughter with her mother's calm thoughtfulness and a son with his father's quiet steadiness, and the garden that had once witnessed a proposal grew now to witness the laughter of a new generation running along its blossoming paths. Visitors to the estate often remarked on the evident happiness between the Duke and Duchess, a warmth that seemed to fill every room they entered together, a stark and welcome contrast to the quiet reserve Nathaniel had once carried before Clara entered his life, and to the anxious hope Clara herself had once carried, before she learned what real, steady devotion truly felt like. Looking back on the entire journey, from the cold church steps where she once stood frozen in heartbreak, through the long months of grief and quiet rebuilding, to the garden, where a steadfast man had finally offered her the promise she had always deserved, Clara often reflected that life has a strange way of leading people exactly where they are meant to be, even when the path there winds through unexpected sorrow. She had waited 3 years for a proposal that never came from the man she once loved, only to discover, in the end, that true happiness had been waiting patiently for her all along, in the form of a quiet, steadfast Duke who chose her, fully and completely, without ever once making her wait in uncertainty again.